Charmian Gooch is a co-founder and director of Global Witness, a nonprofit organization that for 20 years has run pioneering investigations and campaigns uncovering the links between natural resources, corruption, and conflict. Global Witness's research and campaigning has made the organization a leading global voice on what can be done to stamp out the abuse of anonymous companies. She jointly led Global Witness's first campaign exposing the trade in timber between the Khmer Rouge and Thai logging companies and their political and military backers, and developed and launched its second groundbreaking campaign, Combating Blood Diamonds. Last year, she won the TED Prize, a cash award of $1 million given annually to a forward-thinking individual with a fresh, bold vision for sparking global change to make the world a better place. The prize begins with a big wish, one that will motivate people around the world to get involved. Here was Charmian's wish: for us to know who owns and controls companies so that they can no longer be used anonymously against the public good. Let's ignite world opinion, change the law, and together launch a new era of openness in business. Charmian and Global Witness also received the Skoll Award for Social Entrepreneurship for extraordinary innovation in disrupting an unjust and unsustainable status quo. And just 2 weeks ago, she was named one of the most 50 influential people in the world by Bloomberg News Agency. Please join me in welcoming Charmian Gooch to the JCCSF.
Well, Barbara, thank you very much for a lovely introduction. It has been a pretty incredible year for all of us at Global Witness. All of these prizes that are happening, I think somebody said recently, wow, you're an overnight sensation that's been 20 years in the making. It does feel a bit like that. And it's about the whole organization. Just sometimes they need a particular name to kind of hang a prize on. Thank you to all of you for coming tonight. I know that some of you have foregone the giants, so I appreciate that, and I hope this isn't going to be too dry. And thank you to not just to Barbara, but to the JCC for hosting this. It's really great to talk in this space. We were just with a colleague, Christine, and we were just talking about what a nice feel this has, and yeah, so it's very nice to be here. So tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself and Global Witness, and then to talk quite a bit more about the TED Prize campaign to end anonymous company ownership, and particularly how it relates to America. So I'm afraid I've also got a bit of a chest bug, so there may be a bit of coughing kind of off microphone, so bear with me. I'm an activist and a co-founder of this not-for-profit called Global Witness. I guess I'm a lifelong troublemaker. And you see, since the age of about 5, I've always asked the question, but why? And as I grew up, that turned into, but why can't I change this? And little did I realize that this question was going to be kind of one of the leading reasons for why I live my life now and the basis of everything I would do. And then, in my late 20s, so a long time ago, one rainy Sunday afternoon in North London, I was sitting with Simon Taylor and Patrick Alley, and we were friends and colleagues, and we were busy stuffing envelopes for a mail-out, as we often did on a Sunday there, at the office of a great campaign group called the Environmental Investigation Agency. And they did a lot of work on wildlife trade issues. And as usual, we were talking about the world's problems, and in particular about the civil war in Cambodia, which we had talked about many, many times before. We'd all been tracking what had been going on for years. And we'd heard about how one of the parties to the war, the genocidal Khmer Rouge, were using money from illegal logging to keep fighting. And we had often asked ourselves, well, why isn't anyone doing anything to tackle this problem? The Khmer Rouge were earning millions of dollars every year from this trade, and this was a group that were responsible for horrendous war crimes and the deaths of nearly 2 million people. That's about a third of the country. And there was a moment when we just stopped and looked at each other and asked ourselves, well, why don't we try and do something? And it was a crazy question at the time, but we stuck with it. And I'm going to show you now, it's just as I keep talking, a little bit of footage. I have to, apologies, it's secretly filmed, so basically it looks rubbish and there's no sound. So, and this is in Cambodia and the Thai border. So the three of us did a huge amount of research. We built a secret pinhole camera, rather Simon and Patrick did because they're the techie ones, and then carefully stitched it into the lining of a bag, and I'm afraid I did that bit, so we're being very gender specific, weren't we? And then we flew over to Thailand. We went undercover pretending to be timber buyers. How anyone thought we were timber buyers, I don't know, because at that point, honestly, we didn't know what we were doing, but we had to learn pretty quickly. And all the while, we were secretly filming and meticulously documenting, using GPSs, the hard evidence of what was actually going on along that Thai-Cambodia border. Now, we took the information and published it, exposing an illegal trade between the Khmer Rouge, the Thai logging companies, who were such a bad bunch of companies, they'd been thrown out of Burma. So it tells you something about what kind of companies they were. And they're not just the Thai companies, but they're political and military backers. In the face of this kind of irrefutable evidence, policymakers had to act, but we had to have a real fight with State Department first, here in the US, who were, for whom Thailand was militarily very important. And they gave money for military educational training to Thailand, and that was a little bit of leverage that, you know, three people and no money managed to find, and that's what we were targeting. So in the end, the policymakers had to act, and the Thai-Cambodia border was closed. It cut off funding to the Khmer Rouge, which during the dry season had been $10 to $20 million a month, and it helped to end the war. And we were slightly astonished, and that was the start of Global Witness. So from that slightly crazy question, now 2 decades and many campaigns later, including, as Barbara kindly mentioned, the Blood Diamond campaign, how diamonds were funding war, well, from that crazy question, we are now an 80-strong team. We're campaigners, investigators, journalists, escapee lawyers, all sorts of people, and we all share the same belief that change really is possible. So what does Global Witness actually do? Well, we investigate, we report to uncover the people really responsible for funding conflict, for stealing millions from citizens around the world, that's also known as state looting, and for destroying the environment. And then we campaign to change the system itself. And for us, we've always seen that really where we work is that nexus where environmental destruction meets human rights abuses, corruption and war, and it's that nexus of those 4 things. And we're not very good at kind of, we don't have an elevator pitch or a simple mission statement, but that's those kind of 4 areas that we work on. And we do this because so many of the countries that are rich in natural resources like oil or diamonds or timber, well, they're home to some of the poorest people on the planet. And this problem of how populations in countries really rich in natural resources they tend to stay very, very poor. Well, that problem, many of you will know, is called the resource curse. And it's not really the trickle-down theory of economics, it's the flood upwards theory of economics, where a tiny number of people get incredibly rich, everybody else stays very, very poor. And for us, it's been a 20-year journey to get to the bottom of this paradox. Now, some of the answers to that question can be found relatively easily in countries like Nigeria, Congo, Angola, or Cambodia, places where gleaming SUVs with blacked-out windows glide out of gated, guarded compounds and roll past slums where inhabitants live in dire poverty, often struggling to survive on $1 or less a day. Now, that's a story we all know well. That's that sort of story of corruption and poverty somewhere over there. But there is another side to this story, which is less well known. And the thing is, many of the causes of this poverty and seemingly faraway problems, well, they can be found in the United Kingdom, in Europe, and right here in the United States. One of the worst of these causes is the problem of anonymous company ownership. Now, that doesn't really sound that bad, does it? But anonymously owned companies, well, they're facilitating corruption, and in doing this, they're helping to keep resource-rich, developing countries stuck in poverty. But they're also used by drug cartels, money launderers, fraudsters, terrorists, arms traffickers, people traffickers, and many more, in crimes that affect all of us, including Americans. I mean, it's everywhere. That's why really I wanted this to be the TED Prize wish. So tonight I'm going to talk about this problem and how it is affecting millions of people around the world, and also the power that we all have right here in the United States to help fix it. The problem of anonymous company ownership has come up time and time again in our work. In so many of the cases that we've looked at, we've seen that citizens are cheated out of their natural resource wealth, and we found this problem of anonymously owned companies. So whether that's to hide the illicit assets of a corrupt politician, disguise the real beneficiaries behind a big minerals deal, or obscure the wholesale looting of state assets. Anonymously owned companies hide the true picture of where the money is going and who is really benefiting, leaving the citizens of that country in the dark. Let me show you what I mean. We've been investigating what happened to just over $1 billion that oil giants Shell and the Italian Eni paid for the rights to an oil block in Nigeria. Now, we found out that the money had been paid to the Nigerian government, who in turn paid the exact same amount onto a front company that was owned by a former Nigerian oil minister, who incidentally is a convicted money launderer. He had awarded himself the company while he was in office, using front companies, and then many years later sought to cash in on the deal. Now, of course, Shell and Eni denied paying any money to the front company, and Eni have issued statements denying any illegal conduct. But court evidence that we've seen shows that they knew this is where the money would end up. Now, the money should have gone to the Nigerian state coffers, but it's now gone to 5 companies with, well, you've guessed it, anonymous owners. And they're part of a network of companies that are headed by obscure individuals, and the money trail that we've been following, well, it ends there. So this case is currently being investigated by authorities in the UK and Italy, and you may well have read about it. And there's been some interesting developments just in the last 2 weeks with the new CEO of Eni under increased scrutiny in Italy. The Nigerian House of Representatives, the lawmaking body there, has already called for the deal to be cancelled and the block taken away from Shell and Eni, which of course would have some impacts on their reserves and their stated assets, because it's a very major block. Eni's former and current CEOs were recently named as suspects in the Italian bribery investigation, and $190 million has been frozen in connection with this case. It's $190 million frozen. But where's the rest of the money? Now, knowing who really owned these companies might not have stopped the deal from taking place, and it might not have stopped the money from falling prey to the corruption, the entrenched corruption that Nigeria really struggles with. But its citizens would have been able to find out where the money went and who really benefited from the deal. And $1 billion might not so easily have disappeared in a country that, despite vast oil revenues, struggles and suffers from desperate poverty. So let me give you some examples of that. So what could have happened with that money, with that $1 billion? $1 billion in Nigeria would have paid for 400,000 midwives to be trained. This is a country when 142 women currently die in childbirth every year. And apparently about... Sorry? Every day. I'm so sorry, you're right, thank you. I'm not very good at doing this bit. An estimated 5.5 million girls are out of school in Nigeria. This amount of money could have paid, well, you can see how much it would have paid for 1.7 million of them to go to school for 5 years each. It's equivalent to 2/3 of the entire health budget of the country. So just think about how you as citizens of a country would feel if there'd been a deal made that you couldn't find out anything about, and it was equivalent to 2/3 of that budget. So another case that we looked at was in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a country that is really desperately trying to emerge from years of a brutal civil war that cost millions of lives. Valuable mining assets were awarded to a set of companies with hidden owners at a fraction of their market value. The assets were then sold on to major multinationals, listed in various stock exchanges, at a massively substantial profit, with the hidden owners pocketing the difference. Now, we don't know who benefited from these deals, but it definitely wasn't the Congolese public. This country continues to rank next to last on the UN Human Development Index, and over 70% of people are living well below the poverty line. The value of the deals are estimated by Kofi Annan's Africa panel to be about $1.35 billion. So it's big sums of money. Or take Sarawak, the Malaysian island of Borneo. Sarawak has just 5% of its incredible, biodiverse, packed full tropical forests left. Yet it continues to export more tropical logs than South America and Africa combined. High-level corruption, decades of intense logging and plantation development, and a total disregard for indigenous communities and their rights has resulted in the decimation of Sarawak's forests. For over 3 decades, this was presided over by the state's former chief minister. He has gone out of office just in the last year, Abdul Taib Mahmoud, who had power over all land allocation and forestry licensing. Now, it was widely rumoured that Taib and his close associates had abused his power and profited enormously from this environmental destruction. But the problem was nobody seemed to be able to prove it. So, posing as a foreign investor interested in buying land for palm oil, our undercover investigator met with Taib's first cousins and others. The footage he recorded showed for the first time the instruments used by the ruling Taib family and its lawyers to skirt Malaysia's laws and taxes, including, of course, using anonymous companies. And all of this has been at the expense of Sarawak's public, especially the state's indigenous people. I'd like to show you an edited version. It's edited down from 16 minutes to about 9 minutes of this footage that we published last year, and it's going to run for about 9 minutes.
This is a film about corruption. The story of a tiny elite secretly enriching themselves by exploiting a country's natural wealth at the expense of its people. Global Witness show exactly how Sarawak's ruling elite are illegally selling off land for personal gain. Posing as investors, Global Witness went undercover in Sarawak to find out how business is done and where the money goes. Although we approached the government directly, officials sent us to members of Taib's own family. One area of land offered to Global Witness was owned by a company called Ample Agro. The company belongs to Taib's first cousins, the Abdul Rahman sisters, daughters of Sarawak's previous chief minister.
Ample Agro belongs to my family. Right. The Land and Survey Department. Okay. Yeah, they are the one that issues this license. Of course, it's from the CM's directive, but I can speak to the CM very easily.
Can you?
Yes.
And do you think he will agree to it?
Yeah. He was the one who gave us that land.
Okay.
Yeah. He's my cousin. So.
His family?
Yeah. His mother and my father are sisters and brothers, siblings.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay. So he's my first cousin, so it's quite easy.
You're proposing basically Ample Agro, which is your company, okay, sell your company rather than the land, and your company owns the land.
Yes. I bought the company as a shell company for this land.
Buying Ample Agro meant we would acquire 5,000 hectares of forest to clear for palm oil. The land is home to many indigenous communities, some living in the area for more than a century. To sort out the deal, the sisters put us in touch with their lawyer, Alvin Chong. Alvin represents the state government and many prominent companies with close links to Taib's family.
They are daughters of the former chief minister of Sarawak. You are talking to people of substance, people who have assets in their hands, okay?
The company's based here. Are you expecting it to be purchased here or funds purchased here? I mean, what's the mechanism?
Well, there are different ways of doing it. Some people do it this way. Certain portions are paid here, and the balance of it can be paid in Singapore.
Right.
Outside.
Why they do that is to save on the RPGT.
Yeah.
Because any land-based company,
Sorry, what's RPGT?
real property gains tax. So in order to save on the RPGT, only a certain portion is paid here and the other portion is paid.
Okay,
so
and you pay
will
the 10% on the portion paid here?
Yes, and the one that's paid outside you don't get taxed because you don't declare that.
The proposed payment is illegal, punishable by up to 3 years in prison.
Now, have you done, I mean, it's fairly standard doing it through Singapore.
Yes.
Okay.
You will have to do 2 sets of agreement.
One in
One
Singapore.
from here and one to cover. It's done here. Both agreements are done here.
Okay.
But the other one specifies the full amount where the details are spelled out.
Okay.
Whilst the ones here is only just for the portion that's here.
And can you assure me that we won't fall foul of anything doing it that way?
No, it's been done.
It's been done.
It's been done before.
This deal shows how money due to the state is stolen and hidden overseas. Malaysia has the world's 3rd largest flow of capital flight, losing the country an estimated $285 billion between 2001 and 2010. In addition to tax evasion, Alvin also suggests a method to give foreign investors total control of companies, in violation of Malaysian law.
Let me highlight something to you first.
Okay.
Before you and your client or even going to talk specific terms,
Yeah.
you have to overcome one major hurdle. How are you going to manage the 51%? 51% of the shareholding
Of the shareholding.
must be held by Malaysian citizens. I can put into place a mechanism to control the local shareholding.
Now this, should we call this person effectively a kind of nominee, really?
It has to be. It is indeed.
It is a nominee, yes. Okay, this nominee is likely to be...
Okay, all these instruments that I'm creating,
Yeah,
it's not going to be done here. It's going to be locked up somewhere
in Singapore.
in Singapore. Why? Because the local law says that the local shareholders have to declare that they are not holding the shares on trust. You do it in Singapore, that it won't surface, and the nominees is not going to keep a shred of paper.
I think your ideas for nominees or proxies or whatever is
Very attractive,
well, yeah, I think it's very
practical.
it's very thought through.
Oh, it is. I put it to use many a times.
Where would you say a nominee or, should come from in the sort of social political spectrum here, or business community?
In the lowest rank we can find in a remote area, they would not be distracted by clever advices. What I normally do is to tell you some trade secrets as such, is that we find some guys who they're villages or whatever, sign up all this stuff to us. We can't even reach them. They wouldn't know how to find a lawyer, wouldn't they?
I suppose it solves some of the problems in terms of...
It's cheap, it's really cheap. Can you imagine the villager comes to town and you say, I'm giving you $10,000. My God.
Yeah.
He's going back to the village, he'll be the one-eyed man who's king in the land of the blind,
Taib's inner circle repeatedly expressed a sense of personal entitlement to Sarawak's land and resources, and showed contempt for its indigenous people.
What we had was a state land, okay? Even though it's a state land, any land in Malaysia, the minute, the pretty naughty people, the minute they hear land is naughty people, okay, they try to make money. So the minute they hear, they have people in land and survey department who would tell them, look, this land has been given, has been titled to this company to do all farm and whatnot, they'll plonk themselves there.
Technically, they cannot claim at all, but they could make life difficult if you don't accommodate them. They may, they may harass you. That's all. They are actually squatters on the land. because the land doesn't belong to them, it's a government land. So they're squatting. Now that you've been out, you know, like in the Styrian Hall, you know, they're very, very poor, and when leaders come, they look at leaders like they're kings. And they always expect some handouts and things like that, you know? And, you know, I'm not making any excuses or whatever, but, you know, I mean, if you look at the good that he's done for the state,
Yeah.
it outweighs all the things that people have said about him. I know people are talking about him being corrupted and all, but I think who isn't in this world?
Well,
When they're leaders.
Right. So it's pretty shocking, and the arrogance and the entitlement on one hand, and the impact on people's lives, Indigenous people's lives, and just local people's lives is really horrendous. So I could show you lots of other examples from our work where anonymous company ownership has been used to reinforce secrecy that allows corruption to happen. Measures of the true scale of the problem are, not surprisingly, hard to come by. To give one indication of how big the issue is, a World Bank study in 2011 reviewed 200 cases of grand corruption, really big-scale corruption, and it found that over 70% of those cases had used and involved anonymous owners. These cases totaled $56 billion. But what we found is that anonymously owned companies aren't just found in natural resource deals, corruption, or developing countries. What's shocking is the truly varied and global scale of this problem. And this anonymity has made a whole host of different crimes possible around the world, including right here in America. The United States is a country built on freedom, fairness, and enterprise. There's the view that if people work hard and pay their dues, they can expect at least an okay, if not a good life, in which they are financially and physically secure. Sometimes it just doesn't work out that way because some individuals are abusing the rights of others. Last week, we launched a report called The Great Ripoff. And it's here, and there's lots outside if you want to take one away. And this details, it gives dozens of examples of a whole range of crimes and predatory behavior across the US that all have two things in common. All were carried out by anonymous owners of companies, and authorities are spending huge amounts of time and money trying to stop them. Now, whether that's scammers and fraudsters cheating vulnerable people like the young, the old, or the sick out of the things they desperately need to get by in life, or dishonest public officials using their positions for personal gain rather than representing the needs of their citizens and the country, or even terrorists and mobsters running criminal enterprises that hurt ordinary citizens' interests in ways that are very hard to predict and cost a huge amount to investigate and stop. One of these was a $6 million human trafficking scheme in which anonymous company owners tricked their victims into a life likened to modern-day slavery, hiding their real identities behind a web of anonymous companies registered in Kansas, Missouri, and Ohio. The largely Moldavan gang ran employment companies that supplied hundreds of foreign nationals to hotels, resorts, and casinos in 14 states across America. According to the indictment against some of the individuals involved, victims from Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, the Philippines, and elsewhere were lured into America with false promises and then forced to live in overpriced, overcrowded, and substandard apartments. The gang withheld much of their earnings, allowed their visas to expire, and threatened the workers with deportation and extra fees if they left. they used the anonymous companies to obscure the links between the illegal activity and the main corporation they used in the scam, and to launder their illegal money. The ringleader of this scam was, you might be pleased to hear, was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Now, education, it's fundamental to all Americans getting a fair chance in life. In another case, one government official denied Ohio school children their dues by setting up a web of fake companies, which he then paid millions of dollars for non-existent services. The official was responsible for managing his school district's IT department, and between 2007 and 2011, he and his associates set up a number of shell companies that enabled them to steal at least $3.4 million by submitting fake invoices for IT products and services they never delivered. According to court documents, the companies were simply shells, established to, and I quote, conceal the illegal nature of such funds and to avoid detection by law enforcement. The official then authorized the district to pay the invoices by issuing checks to the shell companies. The nominee owners of the shells kept approximately half of the money and gave the other half to the official for his own enrichment. He pled guilty to conspiracy to commit mail fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and wire fraud, and was also sentenced to more than 11 years in prison back in 2013. And how about politics? Some of you may be wondering. Well, maybe not surprising. Anonymous company ownership has been used to disguise campaign contributions and potential efforts to buy influence over the democratic process in America. During the 2012 election cycle, NBC reported that a shell company with anonymous owners made a $1 million donation to Restore Our Future, a pro-Mitt Romney PAC. The company was incorporated in Delaware only 6 weeks before making the donation. It then quickly dissolved, leaving no trace of the person who controlled it, 2 weeks before the PAC made its first campaign filing of the year, which was the first time the public could see its donors. Now, the negative publicity surrounding this news report, and a lot of you may remember this case really well, it led to the anonymous company owner to identify himself as Edward Conard, a former Bain Capital executive, which the PAC then later confirmed. Conard said he'd made the donation after consulting with lawyers who had reassured him that the donation would comply with election financing laws. Now, in this case, public outrage drew the financier out into the open, but there's no reason to believe that this is a one-off. As long as people are able to hide the payments they make to political campaigns behind American shell companies with anonymous owners, voters simply cannot know who is buying what kind of influence over their decision makers. Now, there is a common misunderstanding that money launderers always look to sunny or mountainous tax havens like the Cayman Islands or Switzerland for the secrecy that they need to cover their tracks. But actually, the services that they require are as readily available in major financial centres like London, one of the world's leading facilitators of these issues, and, I'm afraid, America, and often more so. They are provided by lawyers, company service providers, and other middlemen who are supposed to be the pillars of society and to safeguard the protections and privileges that we value, not enable crimes that threaten them. Now, somewhat shockingly, the World Bank found that the US was the favourite destination for corrupt politicians from around the world to set up companies to move or hide dirty money, and I quote from the World Bank report, this is especially concerning given the huge number of legal entities formed each year in the US, around 10 times more than in all 41 tax havens combined. Now, I'm going to repeat that, 10 times more than in all other tax havens combined. That's why we're here campaigning on this. We have an office in Washington that's very focused on this issue. Now, it's really, really easy to set up a company in America, regardless of what you want to use it for. A recent study carried out by some academics doing a sort of mystery shopper exercise found that out of 60 countries sampled worldwide, only one country, Kenya, made it easier than the US to set up a company without disclosing who the owners are. Now, the study showed how little time it took to find a US corporate service provider who was willing to set up a company with anonymous owners for inquiries that sounded like a front for terrorism or for those that should have raised a corruption risk. It was pretty shocking. The evidence strongly suggests that in most cases, company service providers simply aren't interested in who you are or what you're doing, and current US laws don't require them to be. It's out of kilter with other legal requirements. You can provide less information to set up a company than you do to get a driving license or register to vote. In the US, companies are created at the state level, so information on ownership varies state by state, but no state requires the collection of information about the ultimate or beneficial owners of companies. That is, no state requires information to be collected that identifies the real, live human beings behind companies. While some states do collect shareholder information, these shareholders can be other companies with anonymous owners or nominees who are essentially front people for the real owners of the company. So it's perfectly legal to set up American companies with anonymous owners. Now, as the cases I've just talked about show, this is letting con artists and criminals get away with all sorts of wrongdoing. US laws enabled these criminals to hide behind the secrecy that anonymous companies offer, to pull off schemes that have ripped off everyone from the young to the old and the faithful. Now, of course, states didn't set out to allow the creation of companies with anonymous owners to be used in this way. And it's not just criminals who use them. Anonymously owned companies are not in and of themselves the crime. But the problem is that they are the getaway car of choice. Whether it's tax avoiders, fraudsters, corrupt politicians, and more, they all use this vehicle because it masks their identity and it shields them from accountability. Now, criminals have figured out how to take advantage of gaps in the law. They always have done and they always will. And when loopholes like this are exploited, they need to be closed, especially when they're enabling such a wide range of crimes that the government really wants to stop. Yet, states have been aware of this problem for many years and have taken very little meaningful action to address it. Without action from all of us, nothing is going to happen. This is a massive failure that is having a real impact on millions of people here in America and in countries all over the world. And just to be clear, this is not an attack on business and companies. It's not about stigmatizing business at all. Companies exist for really good reasons, to limit liability if a business idea doesn't work out, and to make sure that would-be entrepreneurs don't go bankrupt. It's a very sound principle which allows business to flourish, but it is being abused by people with no interest in legitimate business. They just need a smokescreen behind which they are free to rip off innocent people and society as a whole. Now, in the era of Edward Snowden and revelations about the NSA, anonymity could seem like a way to hold on to personal privacy in the face of Big Brother, and each and every one of us has the right to privacy. But this right has to be balanced with the need to stop criminals selling drugs, ripping people off, and committing other horrifying crimes that affect all of us and the society we live in. There's somewhere a balance between protecting the rights of the individual and protecting others' rights not to be harmed. And maybe it's somewhere around where private acts or facts have big public implications. So it's about making sure that we have just enough information that we need on our business partners. It's fundamentally about saying that for our economies to work properly, we need the right information. And as things stand, anonymous owners are able to steal from governments, businesses, and ordinary people while remaining faceless and unaccountable. It's easy, and the structures are, as I've said before, as I've already said, completely legal. But it doesn't have to be this way. To quote Paul Collier, a prominent development economist and advisor to the UK Prime Minister, and I quote him, "Corporate opacity is not inadvertent. It is the cumulative achievement of the sustained effort of some of the most brilliant professional minds on the planet." I think you can tell he's an economist. Now, the breadth and range of cases that I've talked about and their locations point to the urgent need for swift and effective action. It's time to stop abusive behaviour by anonymous company owners. It's time to change the law. We need laws so that registries list the true owners of companies and can be accessed by everyone. Given that anyone can incorporate a company anywhere in the world, we need a global solution to this problem. This means that every country must require this information to be disclosed and accessible to the public. But this global standard must be led by the US, where so many of the world's anonymously owned companies are set up. Public registries would help law enforcement in the fight against corruption and other crime, and including the financing of terrorism. In most of the cases affecting US citizens that we've looked at, the authorities did catch up with the people responsible, but not without expensive and time-consuming investigations and court proceedings to peel away the layers of secrecy, a bit like trying to unpack a series of Russian dolls and uncover what was really going on. Public registries would bring the kind of transparency that allows citizens, journalists, businesses, customers, and civil society to demand accountability. It would allow all of us to hold companies, their owners, and our governments to account for actions that affect each and every one of us around the world. By setting up public registries of the real owners of companies, business can be brought out into the open. And this simple measure, if implemented globally, would help to tackle the big and very complex problem that is the reality of corruption. It would be an important step, but let's be clear, it's not a magic bullet that's going to end all corruption everywhere overnight. So this is, yes, it is an ambitious idea. But as an activist and a lifelong troublemaker, I've seen what can happen when big disruptive ideas gain momentum. I've seen lots of inspiring stories of change over the years. But I'm going to share one personal story with you about this. So in the late 90s, we were looking at blood diamonds in Angola. And I was there pretty much undercover. Luanda back then was full of landmine victims struggling to survive on the streets and war orphans living literally in sewers under the streets, and a very tiny and very wealthy elite who gossiped about shopping trips to Portugal and Brazil and America. And it was a really slightly crazy place. But there was another story that emerged from this investigation and this work that I hadn't been expecting to find. I'd been speaking to lots of people there who talked not about diamonds, but about a massive web of corruption on a global scale and millions of oil dollars going missing. And frankly, Global Witness was then a tiny organization of, I think, about 5 people. We'd grown to all of 5 people by that point. So trying to work out how we might begin to tackle this web of corruption and the millions, and it turned out to be billions of dollars, oil dollars going missing, was pretty daunting. And I remember making the phone call to Simon and Patrick, they were back in London, where I was trying to explain to them what I'd found out and what people were telling me. And I was very confused because I was saying, I know I'm supposed to be here looking at blood diamonds, but this other issue looks really, really important. And they instantly just said, right, we've got to look at this. So the solution, well, we called for oil companies to publish the payments that they make to governments. We thought that bringing transparency to these payments would do away with some of the secrecy in this notoriously murky sector, and that this information would be an arrow in the bow of citizens trying to hold their governments accountable for management of millions and billions of dollars in natural resource wealth. On the wall of our office in London, we have that wonderful quote from Arthur Schopenhauer that some of you may know, which goes, "All truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as being self-evident." Now, I love that quote. It's in a little postcard on my wall. When we first called for oil companies to publish their payments, we were laughed at for being naive and unrealistic. That's not how business operated. And these are favorite labels used by skeptics. But fast forward 15 years, and not only has the need for transparency of natural resource revenues been accepted as the norm, it has also become the law. And very, very slowly, it became a global movement as hundreds of civil society organizations from around the world became involved with this. The US led the way when it introduced the Dodd-Frank Act in 2010, which requires every oil, gas, and mining company listed on US stock exchanges to publish their payments to governments, such as taxes and royalties and license fees in every country they do business. The European Union and its member states soon followed suit. 70% of the biggest publicly listed extractive companies around the world are now covered by these laws. 70%. And this is in addition to voluntary multi-stakeholder initiatives like the not very snappily named Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. Sorry about that. Which brings together governments, civil society, and companies. So the transparency genie is well and truly out of the bottle, and it's not going back in that bottle. This is what can happen when a big idea gathers momentum and support. And that's why it's so exciting to see how the idea that we need transparency around ownership of companies is picking up speed too. Recognition is growing in the US and around the world that something must be done to stop companies with anonymous owners from harming innocent people. Law enforcement groups are increasingly supportive. To quote the national president of the US Federal Law Officers Enforcement Association, he says, "We must eliminate the corporate foxholes that criminals cower in and ensure business accountability and transparency. Requiring corporate filers to disclose who the beneficiaries are isn't an invasion of privacy," he says, "it's a proclamation of integrity." Others want to see an end to companies that are owned anonymously too, and we've seen support from everyone from small businesses to investors, faith leaders, organised labour, public interest groups, and human rights and anti-corruption advocates. All of these voices are increasingly being heard by policymakers. In 2013, the issue of these anonymous company owners was high on the agenda of the G8. All G8 countries, including the US, endorsed broad principles around company ownership disclosure and agreed to take concrete steps to tackle the problem. The UK is moving forward with the world's first public registry of beneficial ownership information, which is frankly amazing. 3.5 years ago, they were hostile to the idea. And that's what I mean about momentum and seeing the sense of momentum really growing. So what that is going to mean, the law is under discussion at the moment, is that it's going to be possible to find out who ultimately owns and controls British companies, even if they're owned by an offshore company. And for the people of Ukraine, that would have been really useful because they found that the former president's compound, worth a huge amount of money, was in fact owned by companies in Austria and London. So that would have certainly helped them. The European Union is currently considering the issue of anonymous company ownership. In March of this year, the European Parliament voted overwhelmingly by about 90% in favour of public registries. So that means that the European Union member governments are now having to consider in very early stages whether they're going to follow the UK government. And of course, a lot could go wrong. When the G20 meets next month in Australia, the issue of companies with anonymous owners will be on the agenda, and all G20 countries, that's all of them, including China and India, are expected to make commitments to address this issue. And again, it's the work of many, many campaign groups around the world that's got to this point. And in the US, which is so important, 10 times more than all the other tax haven jurisdictions combined, well, there has been some movement too. The Obama administration has committed to push for legislation that would require meaningful disclosure of beneficial ownership information at the time that an American company is formed. Transparency of the real owners of companies is so important to US national security that President Obama has also included a commitment to work with Congress on this issue in his strategy to combat transnational organized crime. In Delaware, they are debating the issue. In recent months, half of Delaware's state legislature called on the Delaware congressional delegation to support federal legislation to solve this problem. Now, that might not sound like such a big deal, but for a state that for many is synonymous with corporate secrecy and once described in the New York Times as a den of thieves by a former special agent of the US Treasury Department, well, excuse me, to have this issue on the agenda in Delaware is a real live example of momentum in action. It just shows what can happen. Key individuals in Congress are also seeking to end anonymous company ownership in America. And since 2008, there have been bipartisan bills pending that would require American companies to disclose their beneficial owners. If done right, these bills could make a huge difference in the US, leading the way towards a global standard for transparency. But at the moment, federal legislation remains stalled because of organised opposition from the National Association of Secretaries of State and their allies. Its members are concerned over the perceived cost of collecting this information on their budgets. In fact, a change in the law would save money from states' budgets by reducing the time and money currently spent trying to track down the anonymous company owners behind so many crimes in the US. The law would also generate new revenue for states by increasing the collection of fines, penalties, and asset forfeitures that result from the improved ability of law enforcement to pursue and prosecute criminals. When the UK government looked at this, they found that there was actually a cost saving in doing this. Now, and I know it's a different size and a different system, but that nevertheless. So, to conclude, I know it's been a long evening, and I think there's some wine outside. To conclude, we need to move forward with putting practice into solutions to this problem in the US and beyond. We need information to be collected about the real living and breathing human beings that control companies. And we need this information to be accessible in public registries. If they're not in public registries, it's not going to be good enough because it means that people around the world aren't going to be able to find things out, and citizens here won't be able to find things out. It's not just about the police and crime and law enforcement being able to put in formal applications for information that frankly tip off all of those involved in the company. And the reason that we need to do this is because in this digital era that we're now in, the world really has changed. The way we think about access to information, about companies, and about governments. It's changed forever, and it's going to keep changing. And at moments like this, norms can shift quickly, and we look back and wonder how things were ever done that old way, like women getting the vote in some countries and other big changes. Now, this is an issue whose time has come. Stopping criminals from using anonymous companies will help stamp out a raft of more visible crimes. There is no moral or economic argument for the status quo, and together we can easily change it. And each of us can play a role in making this change a reality. We need to spread the word and share the real human stories behind this issue, because this is not just a dry policy issue, and I'm sorry if this has been a bit dry this evening, but it really does affect all of us. You can find more of these human stories in our new report that we launched last week, I mentioned earlier, called The Great Rip-Off. We're very proud of it. It's available on our website for free and outside the door. Now, ambitious changes need support from all reaches of society, including the business community. And that's why I'm so delighted that business leaders are getting on board. eBay founder, philanthropist, and social entrepreneur Jeff Skoll has called this the right move at the right time. Telecoms billionaire Mo Ibrahim has said he supports this campaign to end anonymous companies. But this is just the beginning. And if, having heard this, you would like to take some action, here are some of the ways that you can do this. If you're a business leader and want to speak out publicly about this issue, or work with us on new initiatives that show the way forward to other businesses, then please contact me. And we all need to make our voices heard. You can really help right here in California by urging the Attorney General, Kamala Harris, and the candidates for the California Secretary of State to publicly support ending anonymous companies. That would be really powerful. You could also thank Senator Feinstein, who is a co-sponsor of that federal bill I mentioned earlier. Now, really in conclusion, we have seen some incredible momentum in the last 2 years, momentum that I really couldn't have imagined when we first came across this problem all those years ago. And I hope that you will join us on this journey and be part of this change. Thank you.
So, questions?
It seems to me when I go into my bank and I try and transfer money from one account to another, I go through so many steps to do it, and my name's attached to everything. And I guess I'm wondering what efforts have been to get the banks. I know you're trying to, legislation is one way to start, but on the back end, everybody uses banks to move money around. And why are they always left off the hook about not needing a name attached to transfers and things like that?
It's really interesting that you raised that. We do actually campaign on that issue as well for all the same reasons that we're working on anonymous company ownership. We're really looking at the facilitators of corruption. And it does seem funny, doesn't it? If you want to move $5,000, you need so much information, but if you want to move $1 billion, it just doesn't seem to be that much of a problem. There are some pretty depressing stats around this. The Financial Services Authority in the UK, it did a study a couple of years ago looking at the sort of top biggest 50 banks in the UK, and it found, I think none of them, I think it was none, it might have been 3/4, were not implementing the existing laws that exist about knowing your customer, particularly around politically exposed persons, the PEPs, which particularly in relation to government officials or families, family members of government officials. You know, why is it that the son of a president is looking to transfer hundreds of millions of dollars when he has an official salary of $5,000 a month? You know, you'd think that would raise some flags. And it is. I mean, banks are kind of Teflon coated, and I wonder how much bigger do the fines have to get. And America on this is really doing amazing work in terms of pursuing banks. So what it did with HSBC, the biggest ever fine for anti-money laundering failures over at HSBC and the laundering the Mexican drug cartels money. But even that said, it was $1.9 billion. Sounds like a lot of money. It was the biggest fine ever for anti-money laundering failures. It was about 12% of their profit that year. So, and they'd warned all their investors. So at some point, investors surely are going to start objecting on this. And the problem is governments need, which they're so bad at doing, to push banks on this issue. And I think, again, as the public, we need to be protesting on this issue too.
Yes, how do you decide what issues to investigate? Do people come to you, or do you decide as a group what you're going to do?
Both. So one of the campaigns we worked on with an amazing Liberian campaigner who's a Goldman Prize winner, Silas Shiakur of SDI, and he came to us and said, look, Charles Taylor of Liberia is using illegal log exports to fund conflict and mayhem across West Africa. Why aren't you guys working on it? And we were like, wow, that's a good question. So we worked together on it, and they did the undercover investigations in country, and we worked to get a sanction at the UN, and it was really powerful. It really cut off his funding. So sometimes people come to us, and other times there's something that's going on, or we're seeing things in a different way, like I suppose this issue on anonymous company ownership. It's all there. It's a kind of scandal hidden in plain sight. And we do have, we actually do have some criteria that we try and apply. And some of those are things like, let's not duplicate what other people are doing. Can we actually have any impact here? Do we have anything to bring to this? Is there somebody else who could do it better? What we're not very good at saying is, what is our exit strategy? So that's why we just keep kind of growing. And we sort of feel we should stick with issues.
Hi. I'm wondering, where do you get your funding from? Are you looking for public donations, or are there other ways that you get?
Always welcome. We are mostly funded by charitable foundations and trusts. Surprisingly, we get some money from government, from different governments, Swedish, Norwegian. Christine, who's our development director, will add some of the UK government for work we're doing on forests, and individual donations. But as an organisation, I guess because of those Sunday afternoons stuffing envelopes for mail-outs, Simon and Patrick and I felt that we didn't want to start an organisation that was based around membership, because to have that was a whole different, you need to have a lot more staff, you need to have an administration, you're mailing out every 6 weeks, and we just felt that wasn't for us. Our first efforts of fundraising were pretty pathetic. Literally shaking cans to raise money at underground stations. And the day that we raised, it was about equivalent of about $16. We realized we weren't going to get to Cambodia on that. So we started writing funding proposals.
Next question's here in the back.
Hi. So thank you so much for speaking tonight. I learned a lot, and I have kind of 2 questions. First is, what's going to happen to the company that been busted? And second of all, I know that the situation is happening in Vietnam, the same in Vietnam, where it happened in Malaysia. I'm Vietnamese, so I know. So I'm curious, is there because I'm also into education. How can we educate the next generation not to go into the same thing? Because then we kind of like keep chasing the same rat. And
that's a really good point. Well, come and talk to me afterwards about the information on Vietnam. In terms of if it's the big Nigeria deal you're referring to, it's all in play. In fact, it only came to light because 2 of the middlemen in the deal went to court in New York saying they hadn't been paid enough for the deal. And everything came out from there. So the Italian authorities are investigating, UK authorities are investigating. We don't know. We don't know what will happen. We don't know if Shell and Eni will lose their deal or not. We don't know. And in terms of education, I completely agree. And I think one of my sort of dreams would be to try and find a way to educate business students and law students and financial students about some of these issues and what some of the impacts of what often seem like very remote decisions. Like you saw the lawyer, the Malaysian lawyer, talking about, oh yeah, we'll do it all in Singapore and this is how we do it. And completely disconnected from the reality and the impacts of what he was doing.
We've heard a lot here in San Francisco about the ivory trade and the funding of terrorists, Somalia, etc. Can you speak to that? That would seem to be a natural campaign, but...
Well, I think that there are other organizations like the Environmental Investigation Agency who vested interest, or an interest here. I started out, that's where I learned kind of what I do at the Environmental Investigation Agency, and the first thing that I worked on, in fact, was the ivory trade and the illegal ivory trade, so I'm very passionate about it. But EIA are doing a great job. There are other campaign groups doing great jobs on this. So for us, we just can't see how we're going to go in and duplicate. And, but personally, I'm passionate about it. And really, I mean, elephants they're on their way out. It's incredibly depressing to see how in the late 80s there was all this work to get the African elephant listed on Appendix 1 of the Ivory Control Scheme. And it bought some time, but I'm afraid I think it's really about consumption and about the marketplace. And so often with these issues, people people look at it and say, oh, it's a problem of porous borders in Africa or corruption in Africa or whatever. But actually, it's that huge pull and draw of the marketplace that is the massive problem here, I think.
Question in the back. I have a lot of questions, but I'll just ask one. The UN as an agency, does it have any initiatives that have come up as a result of your work the last 20 years? Because there's so much focus on the environment, on all sorts of cross, things that go cross UN millennium goals, et cetera, rather than silos going across agencies. Is there anything that's all-encompassing that's focusing in at the UN?
There isn't anything that is all-encompassing across everything. There are various, whether it's corruption, whether it's, and I could include the World Bank in this, around forests, the UN sanction on Liberian timber, and so and there's a kind of growing awareness, but it's been very difficult to really push the UN to learn the lessons that it should be learning from what it's doing. Depressingly difficult, and we've really tried to sort of push to get them to really take on board issues around how natural resources are involved in funding and driving conflict and instability. And I'd say no, it's a real work in progress. I mean, so the work, what came out of, for example, the Blood Diamond work wasn't UN, it was Kimberley process, which is a very imperfect government-to-government import-export control scheme for rough diamonds that ultimately we left because it couldn't resolve problems and issues.
Next question's back here.
Thank you very much. You've talked a little bit about the process of changing the law and how the idea gained traction over time, and I think now in retrospective it seems very easy, but I think it's a very cumbersome process, and I would just like to understand a little bit better what were some milestones on the way for this idea to gain traction.
Gosh. Well, I suppose quite a few, and the law is hotly contested. Dinosaur, the American Petroleum Institute, is fighting back, trying to slow down or reverse the progress around this transparency law. It's, I see it as a very, it's overturning a way of working, the way governments, individuals and companies work around resources. So I think it's a very long-term fight. So just because there is law there doesn't mean it's working. That still has to be kind of tested. And there's still a really big fight. I mean, it's going in the right direction, but it's not there yet, I'm afraid.
As Charmian has mentioned, she wants an opportunity to meet all of you, so we will have a reception in the atrium. I just, on a personal note, want to thank you for over 20 years of your tireless crusade. The work you're doing is just so very important. So thanks to all of you for coming, and most of all, thanks to you, Charmian Gooch.
Thank you very much. Thank you.